Now, I'm going to be honest, this is a camera I honestly didn't think would ever come to fruition. I'm talking about this, the brand new Fujifilm X-M5, which is the long-awaited successor to the much-loved X-M1. But unlike the X-M1, which had a pretty rocky start to life, this updated version is back with a vengeance, and it includes some seriously impressive tech at a very competitive price point. But before we can get onto all of that good stuff, I first need to mention today's sponsor, and that's One.com. Now, unlike other web creation sites, One.com offers an AI-powered website creation tool that can get your site up and running in a matter of minutes. Just answer a few questions and the AI will generate a customized website design for you. No technical coding skills needed. From there, you can easily tweak the design it's made for you to your liking using the drag and drop website builder. Now, alongside the AI website creator, One.com includes domain registration, hosting, and allows you to create professional email addresses all in one place. There are no hidden fees either, just straightforward, transparent pricing, plus 24/7 customer support is always available to help should you need it. Be sure to get a 14-day free trial using the link in the description below, and also receive 50% off your website using the code TomCalton. And thanks again to One.com for not only sponsoring this episode, but also helping to support this channel. But anyway, if you're not up to date with the drama surrounding season 1 of this camera, then here's everything you need to know in less than 60 seconds. Start the clock. The Fujifilm X-M1 was first released in June 2013 and was the third mirrorless camera announced by Fujifilm following the successful launch of the original X Pro 1 and X-E1. This X-M1 was essentially just a stripped-back version of the X-E1, which itself was a stripped-back version of the X Pro 1. Now, despite its small size, this X-M1 still retained the same X-Trans1 sensor and much of the internal processing and premium build quality as its older siblings, just with no viewfinder. Unfortunately though, despite this thing receiving pretty good reviews, the X-M1 didn't sell as well as Fuji had hoped, and they had to change tactics by scrapping this X-M range in favor of the very similar looking but much more cheaply built X-A range, which was also eventually scrapped. Fast forward about 10 years later, and the X-M1 has been rediscovered by photographers online, like myself, and a new passion for this vintage camera has re-emerged. And it seems that Fujifilm have clearly noticed all of this attention and have thankfully decided to revive this long-lost line in the form of this, the X-M5. Why it's called the M5 and not the M2, I have no idea. Camera manufacturers have a bit of a weird fetish for f***ing around with name conventions for no apparent reason. Anyway, stop the clock. How did I do?
You blew it.
So, needless to say, this long-awaited sequel has some fairly big boots to fill. So how does this compare to the X-M1, and is this new camera truly worthy of starting a whole new chapter in the X-M lineage? Well, aesthetically at least, I think Fujifilm have gotten this one totally right, as they usually do, to be fair. In many ways, this camera is simply an evolution of this X-M1. It's still just as small, lightweight, and easily jacket pocketable, whilst also benefiting from many of the state-of-the-art autofocus and video features that we've seen on recent Fujifilm releases, like the ever-popular X100VI. Now, we'll of course touch on the AF and the video recording side of things a little bit later on in the video, but for now, I want to talk about the handling, because this still includes many of the buttons and dials from the original X-M1 blueprint, but they have managed to make a few subtle improvements and have even managed to cram in a few extra buttons too, including, to my delight, a proper joystick. Now, although you can't see from this angle, it still has two proper command dials, though the rear located one, which was on the X-M1, has actually been moved to the front now, which in my opinion is way more convenient. And it can also be depressed to grant quick access to a bunch of other shooting parameters. But arguably the most noticeable addition has to be this brand new dial at the top here, which has been entirely dedicated to switching between the different film simulation modes. Now, this has come at the sacrifice of the pop-up flash, which I know might upset a few people, but for me, so long as there's a full-size hot shoe port, which there is, that means I can at least add a larger flash or even a remote trigger when I need it, so I'm okay with that. But what do you think? As novel as I think this new dial idea is, I have been continuously debating as to whether this was entirely necessary, especially given the multitude of different ways you can already quickly access the film simulations on this camera without the need for this dial. You can either click the front command dial and scroll through them this way. You can get to them via this quick menu button on the top here. You can even do it the old-fashioned way by just diving into the settings menu. Or if all of that wasn't enough for you, there are 4 dedicated custom modes on the mode dial, all of which can be assigned to different film sims if you want to. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great to have this very clearly labeled and easily accessible option, but I do feel like it's a little bit excessive. And personally, I would have much preferred it if they had just moved the mode dial from here to here and then turned this dial into a completely blank one that's fully customizable. To me, that would have provided a lot more flexibility and room for customization. But all of that said, that's pretty much my entire list of criticisms. One thing, which should make it fairly clear that I think that Fujifilm have actually done a very good job with this camera. One addition in particular that I'm very pleased to see is this flippy, tilty, articulating touchscreen, mainly because there's no viewfinder on this camera, as I've already mentioned, and I'm sure there will be plenty of people in the comments complaining about how there not being a viewfinder is a complete deal breaker. But honestly, if you absolutely need a viewfinder on a camera, there are plenty of other Fuji options to pick from. For example, there's the XE4, which admittedly is due to be replaced sometime soon, hopefully next year in 2025. But this is still a great rangefinder style camera with a very similar aesthetic, albeit without the up-to-date AF and video features. Or of course, if you don't mind sacrificing the option of having interchangeable lenses, then there is the X106, if you can actually get your hands on one of those things, that is. Or if you don't mind your camera looking like an SLR rather than a rangefinder, then you could always go for the XS20, because that camera uses the same sensor as this one and has many of the same video specs. Though the thing to bear in mind is that with all of those options that I just suggested, they're all going to be significantly larger in size and more expensive, because this thing retails body only for just shy of $800 or $900 with the kit lens included, which, considering the specs of this thing, is very good value in my opinion. But it's all well and good that it looks good and handles well, but if it can't take a good picture, then what's the point, right? So how does this fare in terms of photography? Well, on the inside of this X-M5, there's a 26 megapixel X-Trans4 sensor, which admittedly is getting a little bit long in the tooth these days, but it's still more than capable of capturing a great image or two. The colors look nice and natural straight out of the camera, and the raw files are pretty flexible when manipulating them in Lightroom afterwards. But I suspect that given the target market for this camera, most people won't be messing around with raw files anyway, because this bad boy is jammed to the rafters with the latest range of film simulation modes, making it easier than ever to capture beautiful film-like JPEGs straight out of the camera without any editing needed. If you dive deep enough into the camera settings, there are seamlessly endless ways to tinker and customize with the simulation modes on this camera. It also has a proper mechanical shutter, which is able to rattle off shots at speeds up to 8 frames per second. Or if you switch over to the electronic shutter, this can be boosted to 30 frames per second with a slight crop, but don't expect to capture many more than about 30 raw files before the buffer is filled and this whole thing grinds to a halt. Now, as you would kind of expect from a modern Fujifilm camera, this X-M5 benefits from all of the latest subject tracking modes, and overall I found the AF to be plenty quick enough and accurate. Now, by no means is this the best in the business, but again, at this price point, I'm more than happy enough with the performance it gave me. I would also like to thank Fujifilm once again for adding this joystick on the back, because I still believe that this is the easiest way to move the AF point around when shooting one-handed. Now, I know most people like to use the touchscreen these days, but seeing as I have fairly large hands, I actually found that the edge of my palm would occasionally come into contact with the top edge of this screen here, and that would just cause the AF point to fly around a bit. So that's certainly got a little bit annoying. What is this? Ooh.
That boy ain't right.
Anyway, luckily enough, touch to focus can be easily switched off just by the tap of the screen, and that way I could just resort to using the joystick instead. But anyway, hands down, the biggest difference between this X-M1 and this new X-M5 has to be the video shooting modes. On the X-M1, you're pretty much stuck to shooting very basic and dated 1080 HD video capture with an AF performance that had all the vigor of an arthritic sloth. To put it in a much kinder way, this X-M1 is very much a photography only camera, whereas this X-M5 is a hybrid shooter's wet dream. I feel like it's almost like Fujifilm hosted a focus group and asked everyone what kind of video features they wanted to see on this new X-M5, and everyone in the room just kind of went, everything. I'd like everything, please. To which the Fujifilm guys replied, Alright, now I feel like I could make an entirely separate video just talking about the video features on this camera, but for the sake of time and also to preserve the sanity of those of you who are just not interested in video features, here are the highlights. Firstly, 6.2K open gate 10-bit with the option of shooting in f-log 2. Yes please, and thank you. Now if you've not heard of open gate before, it essentially allows you to capture video using the entirety of the sensor. Sure, that means that the footage will adopt a weird square-ish looking 3:2 aspect ratio, ratio, but the upside is that you are more easily able to repurpose your clips in post-production for both vertical content and standard 16:9 videos, entirely removing the need to have to film everything twice. But there's also oversampled 4K footage up to 30 frames per second, or if you want to go up to 60 frames per second, you can do, but it'll apply a small 1.18 times crop. There's also a new feature called 4K LP, or long play, which will add the same 1.18 times crop, but with the intention of extending the record time. Then there's also a vertical recording mode, which allows you to capture 9:16 1080p vertical video whilst keeping the camera fully horizontal. It basically just allows you to record just the center slither of the sensor, but honestly, just do that and get full resolution.
My goodness, what an idea. Why didn't I think of that?
Now, if you're worried about overheating, don't be, because Fujifilm have added the relevant contacts on the back here so that you can add their fan attachment, which will obviously help to prevent overheating if you need to record high resolution footage for long periods of time. Now, speaking of connectivity for add-ons, there's also a mic port right beneath the hot shoe port, and on the opposite side of the camera, there's a headphone output too. But if you accidentally leave your shotgun mic at home and you still want good audio, then the good news is that Fujifilm have also built in multiple mics onto the top of the camera, as you can see by these tiny little dots here, and these could all be adjusted so that you can prioritize the direction in which the camera captures audio to help cut out unwanted background noise. So, needless to say, this is a pretty powerful pocket cine camera too, but there are two fairly big downsides that we do need to touch on. Firstly, there's no IBIS in this camera, which is somewhat to be expected given the low price point, but also probably going to disappoint quite a lot of videographers. They did add digital image stabilization into the camera, but this adds a fairly significant crop to your footage, and the results look a little bit weird and artificial looking. So the reality is, if you want to get steady tracking shots with this, you're probably going to need to pair it with either a lens that has optical image stabilization or a gimbal, or probably both. The second issue is that rolling shutter is also pretty bad, specifically when capturing high resolution 6.2K or 4K footage. So my advice would be to keep your whip pans to a minimum unless you want your footage to look more wobbly than an episode of Baywatch. And yes, I did just make a Baywatch reference in 2024. I surprise myself sometimes, honestly. Now, from a technical standpoint, this is a great camera, undeniably, but does it excite me as much as this X-M1 did and still continues to? Honestly, not quite as much, or at least not in the same way. Now, I think it's fair to say that the X-M1 and most of the older Fujifilm cameras were unapologetically photography-first tools. That's partly the reason why I believe they still hold such a revered place in the hearts of many photographers today. They weren't trying to be everything to everyone. They were built for people who craved the tactile joy of photography and were styled in a way that was a deliberate nod to film cameras that defined an era. Personally, I think one of the reasons why this X-M1 struggled against its siblings like the XE1 and the X Pro 1 was because it strayed just a little bit too far from that classic style and handling. Though, funny enough, these days, it's that uniqueness that makes up a large part of its charm, along with the rising appeal for cheap and portable cameras. Now, whilst this X-M5 clearly adopts these attractive traits, it also feels like it's veering further away from Fujifilm's original ethos. And I completely understand why, because today's creators demand the ability to shift seamlessly between photography and video. But as somebody who would consider themselves to be somewhat of a Fujifilm fan, my fear is that if Fujifilm continues leaning into this all things for all people approach, it kind of risks alienating most of its devoted fans. But then again, maybe this is all just a sign that I am getting way too old, and soon enough I'll be grumbling about how real photography used to be a craft, and then I'll proceed to involuntarily shit my pants whilst calling for a nurse. Or maybe, just maybe, the camera industry's quest for perfection is robbing us of the joy that could be found in imperfection. No, I've definitely just shit my pants. Out of the way, please. Nurse, it's happened again!